Hey everybody, Marcus here. In the previous video, we discussed how Descartes undertook the project to create a new method, the method of doubt we encountered in the discourses and meditations. This method in turn yielded Descartes' first principle, ego cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Upon this principle, Descartes proceeds to build up an argument demonstrating the possibility of knowledge first and foremost in demonstrating to the skeptic that some beliefs, simply by being uttered, cannot be doubted. From here, Descartes demonstrates the existence of God, the existence of the external world, well, and so on. This was all necessary for Descartes, as he was not interested in a mere probabilistic science. No, he was interested in absolute certainty. To those who are not overly familiar with a philosophical jargon, this position lends itself to rationalism. Now, rationalism, at its most basic level, asserts that there are truths that can be known a priori, meaning prior to experience, through reason alone. The most notorious rationalists are people like Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza. This can be contrasted by empiricism, which asserts that, ultimately, all concepts and knowledge have their root a posteriori, namely, from sense perception. The most notorious early empiricists were Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. Now, under this view, Plato is an interesting figure. He is often considered the most extreme position on a spectrum of rationalism. Now, depending on which rationalistic philosopher you interrogate, you will find that many assert that some knowledge is a priori, whereas other knowledge is a posteriori. Plato, on the other hand, asserts that all knowledge is a priori, meaning that knowledge is not possible based on anything coming from the senses. Now, this is a big reason why Socrates, who did dabble with sense perception in his early life, abandoned it completely as well a waste of time. Those things in sense perception are part of the world of becoming, are always in flux, and therefore nothing could be gleaned from them other than opinion. Real knowledge could only be had of those things which are permanent, changeless, eternal, and those things Socrates called, well, forms. As forms could only be accessed via reason, sense perception became irrelevant to the pursuit of knowledge. Now, this is not to say that those things gleaned from sense perception were not useful. No, it means that those things gleaned from sense perception could not properly be considered knowledge. Anyways, for the rest of the video, we will be looking at Nietzsche's critique of Descartes. Now, this video will make a lot more sense if you had watched the previous video, as the things that Nietzsche will be criticizing are explained in depth in that video. Nietzsche's critique of Descartes begins with an attack on Cartesian metaphysics and rationality. Nietzsche writes in The Will to Power, "Logical certainty, transparency, as criterion of truth, all that is true which is perceived clearly and distinctly, with that, the mechanical hypothesis concerning the world is desired and credible. But this is a crude confusion." Now, in this note, Nietzsche attacks both the Cartesian mechanistic worldview and its epistemological underpinnings, Cartesian rationality. These are two pillars of Cartesian thought. To call them into question is to undermine Descartes' entire metaphysical project. Nietzsche amplifies his attack on Cartesian rationality in Human, All Too Human. That the world is not the epitome of an eternal rationality can be conclusively proved by the fact that that piece of the world which we know, I mean our own human rationality, is not so very rational. Although Nietzsche does not explicitly mention Descartes here, the implications for Cartesian metaphysics are clear. If neither the world nor the humans in it are rational, then the claims of Cartesian metaphysics and epistemology cannot hold. Nietzsche is also quite critical of the practical manifestations of the Cartesian project to total rationality, namely Descartes' view of science. Nietzsche's attack on the various aspects of Descartes' brand of physics is developed most fully in his book entitled The Gay Science. Now, it might seem, well, quite ironic that Nietzsche should mount an attack on one of the primary founders of the modern scientific project in a book whose title, well, at least suggests that it will be a defense or apology for science. However, Nietzsche is always extremely careful with his language, and we must be so as well. The title of the book in German is Die Fröhliche Wissenschaft, where Fröhliche connotes gay, happy, well, or merry. It seems likely that an adherent to Cartesian science would have trouble even imagining a science that was, well, happy rather than rational or mechanistic. The gay science, then, is a new science, a particular kind of science aimed directly against the serious, ponderous science of Descartes. Now, Walter Kaufmann, a Nietzsche scholar, and in my opinion the best translator of Nietzsche from German to English, he notes, the title of the book has polemical overtones. It is meant to be anti-German, anti-professorial, anti-academic. It is also meant to suggest light feet, dancing, laughter, and ridicule of the spirit of gravity. Now, it is also, as I see it, anti-Cartesian, and is therefore opposed to conventional enlightened science. It is not, however, opposed to science in general. Traditional, enlightened, or Cartesian science is something dangerous for Nietzsche. He writes, "One thought that in science one possesses and loved something unselfish, harmless, self-sufficient, and truly innocent, in which man's evil impulses had no part whatever, in some, owing to three errors." Cartesian science claims that it represents some kind of objective truth, and that this truth will lead to the kind of progress that the Enlightenment promised. For Nietzsche, however, science is no objective truth. Rather, science also rests on a faith. There simply is no science without presuppositions. Now, Nietzsche is trying to clear the way for a worldview that can go beyond the Cartesian metaphysics that has dominated the intellectual world since the 17th century. To do this, he must undermine the prevalent faith that it is Cartesian science that has the most to offer us as a way of interpreting the world around us. Nietzsche writes, "A scientific interpretation of the world, as you understand it, might therefore still be one of the most stupid of all possible interpretations of the world, meaning that it would be one of the poorest in meaning. Not only does science furnish an inadequate account of the meaning of the world, but it does not even necessarily fulfill its goals of providing useful knowledge about the physical world." Nietzsche writes, "It is a profound and fundamental good fortune that scientific discoveries stand up under examination and furnish the basis, again and again, for further discoveries. After all, this could be otherwise." Now, demonstrating contingency is one of Nietzsche's favorite modes of criticism. He employs it here, well, with great effect against the Cartesian worldview, demonstrating that there is no necessary reason to suppose that Cartesian science can provide the truths to which it claims to have access. The attack on Cartesian science is, well, in many ways, what the gay science is all about. Nietzsche thus writes, "The joyous reaction against the rationalism of Descartes and against the skepticism of the English." Now, these, then, are the terms in which Nietzsche opposes cold Cartesian rationality and its meaningless mechanistic universe. Well, with a merry, joyful kind of science, hitherto unknown in enlightened discourse. Now, if we look at science from an objective position, from a point of view that neither desires nor prejudicially dismisses science, we can start to see what Nietzsche is talking about. Let us think about this for a second. Where Nietzsche says that science rests on a type of faith can be easily argued for, if nowhere else than the problem of induction proposed by Hume. The problem of induction, as it manifests itself in science, is as follows. Now, the scientific process involves the activity of interrogating the world through some sort of experiment and observing the outcome. Once the experiment is done, it is repeated, and as part of the peer review process may be repeated by different people in different places at different times. If indeed all these experiments yield the same observable results, then a law is formulated. This process relies on the assumption that the future will always represent the past. If the future does not represent the past, then what has been observed through experimentation is only true for a time, and therefore not a good standard of knowledge. After all, if I tell you I am sitting down, then say get 3 people to confirm this. We cannot make a law stating that, well, Marcus is sitting down. No. Though it may be true I am sitting down now, it will not be true sometime later. Science, in this way, asserts that its laws will hold true indefinitely if indeed the law is a real law as opposed to a false formulation. However, the idea that the future will represent the past cannot be proven. You cannot make a deductive argument to prove that the future will represent the past because deduction only works on what is necessary and the future is contingent. An inductive argument cannot be made either, because we are trying to prove induction, and therefore any inductive argument would be begging the question, as we would need to assume induction is true in order to prove that induction is true. So from this, we must simply assume induction to be true, though we can never be logically justified in holding that belief. But beyond this, Nietzsche is also attacking science from the perspective that the science that Descartes is proposing robs nature of all meaning. Now, the sad reality is that scientists today are satisfied with this absence of meaning as to, well, why things are the way they are. They are satisfied with a science that explains the how, but never the why. Nietzsche, in turn, was not satisfied with such a shortcoming. Another component of Nietzsche's critique of Descartes is his attack on the Cartesian method itself. This method, essential to the Cartesian project, is the method, well, of universal doubt. Nietzsche writes, starting point. Irony against Descartes. There was at the beginning of things some deceit, out of which we came to think that universal doubt is helpful. Now, in Nietzsche's view, this method, which leads directly to the kind of Cartesian science he abhors, is in fact not helpful at all, but dangerous. We are not on guard against a trap like the will to universal doubt of the Cartesian sort. And it is precisely this Cartesian method that is the worst kind of trick, that thoroughly teases us and keeps us fools. Rather than contributing to true knowledge, the Cartesian method of universal doubt is actually an impediment to knowledge. It precludes the joyous science that Nietzsche wants to advocate. Nietzsche also provides a very stringent critique of Cartesian subjectivity, and this will prove to be fundamental to many of his subsequent critiques. Nietzsche begins with the foundation of subjectivity in Descartes, the Cartesian Cogito. Nietzsche writes, "We must be more careful than Descartes, who remains trapped in a term. Cogito is, after all, only a word." Now, here Nietzsche mounts an effective attack of the Cartesian Cogito by claiming that it is a simple linguistic trick. Descartes attempted to establish Cartesian subjectivity merely by saying the words, "I think, therefore I am." But as Nietzsche points out, this simple statement in no way alters reality or creates a subject where there was none before. What Nietzsche is arguing is that Descartes has no right to claim the cogito as an absolute principle. There's thinking, therefore there's something that thinks? This is the upshot of all Descartes' argumentation. But that means positing as true a priori our belief in the concept of substance, that when there's thought, there has to be something that thinks, is simply a formulation of our grammatical custom that adds a doer to every deed. In short, this is not merely the substantiation of a fact, but a logical metaphysical postulate. Along the lines followed by Descartes, one does not come upon something absolutely certain, but only upon the fact of a very strong belief. Now, this very strong belief, of course, is hardly sufficient to serve as the kind of justification for subjectivity that Descartes needs. By showing that this crucial building block of Cartesian subjectivity is little more than a grammatical custom, Nietzsche immediately undermines the foundation of the Cartesian subject and renders deeply problematic any claims made on the basis of this subjectivity. Now, in a similar vein, Nietzsche suggests that consciousness is also deeply contingent. Nietzsche cites Leibniz's incomparable insight that has been vindicated not only against Descartes, but against everybody who had philosophized before him, that consciousness is merely an occurrence of experience and not its necessary and essential attribute. Now, Nietzsche refuses to accept the claim that without a conscious subject to think our thoughts, no thought can occur. No one today is naive enough to set the I subject as a condition of thinking in the manner of Descartes. Now, it is quite possible and reasonable, Nietzsche argues, to postulate thought simply as something that happens, without reference to the kind of subject that, well, is in Descartes' epistemology absolutely necessary for thought to occur. Now, Martin Heidegger offers an interesting interpretation of Nietzsche's critique of Cartesian subjectivity. So Heidegger writes, "No matter how sharply Nietzsche pits himself time and again against Descartes, whose philosophy grounds modern metaphysics, he turns against Descartes only because the latter still does not posit man as subjectium in a way that is complete and decisive enough. The representation of the subjectium as ego, the I, thus the egoistic interpretation of the subjectium, is still not subjectivist enough for Nietzsche. Modern metaphysics first comes to the full and final determination of its essence in the doctrine of the overman, the doctrine of man's absolute preeminence among being. In that doctrine, Descartes celebrates his supreme triumph." Now, on this interpretation, Nietzsche's problem with Descartes is that Descartes does not offer a strong enough subjectivity. Thus, while on the surface, Nietzsche seems to be offering a virulent critique of the Cartesian project to rational subjectivity, in fact, he is doing so in the name of what is essentially a radicalized Cartesianism. Now, Heidegger writes, "Nietzsche's doctrine, which makes everything that is, and as it is, into the property and product of man, merely carries out the final development of Descartes' doctrine, according to which truth is grounded on the self-certainty of the human subject." Now, according to Heidegger's radical interpretation of Nietzsche's project, Nietzsche attacks only the form of Cartesian subjectivity, but leaves intact, indeed insists upon, the idea that some kind of independent subject is necessary. Nietzsche mistakes the origin of the concept of substance because, in spite of all his criticisms of Descartes, and without an adequate knowledge of the essence of a fundamental metaphysical position, he takes the fundamental position of modern metaphysics as absolutely certain, and stakes everything on the priority of man as subject. Now, Heidegger claims that, without realizing it, Nietzsche is accepting Cartesian assumptions about subjectivity. Well, of course, even Heidegger is forced to admit that Nietzsche makes some fundamental changes to Cartesian subjectivity. The most important of these is that Nietzsche posits the body, rather than the soul, as the seat of subjectivity. Now, Heidegger writes, "For Nietzsche, what underlines is not the I, but the body." Now, up to this point, Heidegger's metacritique, well, that is, his critique of Nietzsche's critique of Descartes, is, well, pretty persuasive. However, it is with the admission of the differences between Nietzsche and Descartes that Heidegger's position breaks down. Now, Heidegger claims that the fact that Nietzsche posits the body in place of the soul and consciousness alters nothing in the fundamental metaphysical position which is determined by Descartes. But in fact, this changes everything. As we have seen, it is precisely the idea of the subject as conscious, rational, and thinking that Nietzsche most strongly criticizes. Nietzsche's critique of the cogito and of Cartesian rationalism is aimed against a particular brand of subjectivity, namely the kind which became institutionalized as the default form of enlightened individualism. Now, Heidegger is quite right when he argues that Nietzsche retains and even insists upon a kind of subjectivity. The Overman, or the Übermensch, is definitely a kind of subject, but it is a subject of a new kind, rooted not in the conscious rationality of Descartes, but in health, the body, and physicality. Now, this emphasis on the body is precisely what distinguishes Nietzsche from Descartes and what motivates his critique of Cartesian subjectivity. Nietzsche's thought is a kind of metaphysics, a new brand of metaphysics that differs from that of Descartes. Now, where Descartes anchored the individual in a substance altogether separate from the physical world, Nietzsche in turn is attempting to bring the I back into the physical world. Now, Nietzsche, in fact, is arguing from a position of a natural ontology, whereas Descartes still has a division that allows for what Nietzsche would call the otherworldly, namely Cartesian dualism. Now, whatever its limitations, the Heideggerian metacritique raises a crucial issue. What, if any, are the aspects of Cartesian metaphysics that Nietzsche retains? Well, to what extent is Nietzsche's critique of Descartes successful, and what are its limitations? Now, Karl Jaspers suggests that when Nietzsche finds methods to be the authentic basis of the compelling validity of scientific knowledge, and then catches sight of the conditions under which they can be employed in the service of life, it seems as though he has discovered an absolute value in methodological science. However, Jasper's claim, must be modified somewhat, for in this initial formulation, it does not account for the fact that statements of absolute value are rare, if non-existent in Nietzsche's work. Nietzsche's refusal to posit absolute values has been called, a sort of perspectivism, which is described as Nietzsche's famous insistence that every view is only one among many possible interpretations, his own views, particularly this very one, included. Now, as Jaspers goes on to admit, it is essential that Nietzsche recognized a kind of truth inhering in the scientific method, and equally essential that, being aware of the limits of scientific truth, he did not regard such truth as final and absolute. Now, if Nietzsche retains some kind of faith in scientific method, then it is a provisional faith. And this clearly distinguishes him from someone like Descartes, whose faith in his method is absolute. Nietzsche's perspectivism is crucial here, for it stands in sharp contrast to the Cartesian method. Descartes' goal, and the goal of many enlightened thinkers who followed him, was to locate the foundation of absolute, universal knowledge. For Nietzsche, this goal is impossible, for such knowledge is radically incoherent. Indeed, this is one of Nietzsche's most important objections to conventional Enlightenment thought. The kind of knowledge that thinkers like Descartes seek is not, for Nietzsche, a possible kind of human knowledge. From what we have seen so far, a large part of Nietzsche's strategy in attacking Descartes was to attack the presuppositions that underpin Descartes' first principle. Nietzsche did this because he believed that objective science, in the way Descartes tried to make it out to be, was impossible, and to continue to hold on to a belief that it was possible was dangerous to the progress of the scientific project. Now, Nietzsche is no enemy to science, but the kind of science he's advocating is hardly that of abstract Cartesian rationalism. It is more vigorous, more lively, a more noble kind of science, the forerunner of, say, the gay science, we may suppose. And it clearly forms one of the cornerstones of Nietzsche's well-known admiration of the Greeks. It is not science that Nietzsche opposes, but modern science. Science in its enlightened Cartesian form. Nietzsche attacks the mechanistic worldview with its elevation of physics, its claim to certitude, and its claim to social benefit. Now, let us be clear that what people today refer to as modern science is pretty much unchanged from what Nietzsche was arguing as being dangerous to the scientific project. A science in which consciousness has only very recently been found to be a player. Now, these criticisms are also brought into the 20th century by philosophers like W.V. Quine. Now, Quine has this to say on what he calls the two dogmas of empiricism. As an empiricist, I continue to think of the conceptual scheme of science as a tool, ultimately for predicting future experience in the light of past experience. Physical objects are conceptually imported into the situation as convenient intermediaries, not by definition in terms of experience, but simply as irreducible posits comparable, epistemologically, well, to the gods of Homer. For my part, I do, qua physicist, believe in physical objects and not in Homer's gods, and I consider it a scientific error to believe otherwise. But in point of epistemological footing, the physical objects and the gods differ only in degree and not in kind. Both sorts of entities enter our conceptions only as cultural posits. Now, let me explain what he is getting at here with further examples. Things that we consider to be scientific, we usually boil down to some sort of mathematical formula. So, for example, we can measure the weight of something. We can measure its length and its volume. Well, what are these things? What is 1 kilogram, for example? 1 kilogram is defined as the weight of 1 liter of water. So, a kilogram is a relative measure to volume. What is 1 liter of water then? Well, a liter of water is some arbitrary volume we have assigned a numerical value of 1. So, here we see that the value of 1 liter is arbitrary. Not only that, but the concept of volume is itself an arbitrary concept when you think about it. What makes what we call volume something interesting, that it should enjoy such a high status in what we call science? I mean, to answer this, Nietzsche would say that volume is not objectively interesting. It is only interesting to humans. Quine, in turn, would say that volume is a theory man had invented, holding no scientific significance other than that we use volume as a necessary theory to do science at all. So to Quine, Zeus and volume are only different in degree and not in kind in how they come to be. Another example is as follows. If we side with Kant and affirm that time is a part of the human condition and not a part of the external world, then so too all scientific formulas that use time become subjective. Now, think of E equals mc squared. The c is the speed of light. Now, speed is a measure of distance over time. As we have sided with Kant for the sake of this argument, and Kant tells us that time is part of the human condition, then we must conclude that E equals mc squared is indeed subjective, even though to our perception it appears objective. In fact, E equals mc squared only makes sense to a being who perceives time. If there was an intelligent being who did not perceive time, then E equals mc squared would, well, just be gibberish that has no bearing on the reality they experience. A reality in which E equals mc squared would hold absolutely no predictive power, even though humans and this being share the same reality. Nietzsche's criticism of Descartes and the modern project in which the Enlightenment plays a big part is an attack on the form of limited subjectivity that exists in the Cartesian Cogito, and also an attack on the expanded objectivity that this limited subjectivity allots to science. For Nietzsche, science is hurt and grossly diminished by the Cartesian project. Where modernity places nature as ontically prior to God and the human being in response to the nominalist position, Nietzsche is trying to tell us that there is no defining of man according to nature, as our definition of nature and man is ultimately mediated through man himself. In other words, there is no objective point of view defined as a view from nowhere. There's only man's point of view. Now, in this way, objectivity becomes a rigorous and systematized form of subjectivity, but is ultimately subjective to man. In addition to this, as meaning is important to the human condition, any science that omits this dimension is inherently defective. In Nietzsche's science, the gay science, there would be an accounting of meaning as well. Descartes, as well as others who believed strongly in the modern project, believed that everything could ultimately be grounded on Cartesian rationalism and Cartesian science, including morals and politics. As Nietzsche rightly points out, no such grounding will ever be possible until science itself is of a kind that accounts for meaning. as both Cartesian science and Cartesian rationalism do not account for meaning. Nietzsche concludes that the Enlightenment project is doomed to failure and will never deliver on its promises. Now, many people, as Nietzsche saw during his life, were turning to science as the substitute for religion. Nietzsche feared that Cartesian science, unable to account for meaning, ultimately contributed to the nihilism that was rising at the time. With the death of God, and no suitable substitute in which to ground morality, well, certainly not the hollow, mechanistic, rationalistic, cold science of Descartes, Nietzsche offers the Overman and the gay science as a solution. The Overman as the model of man to replace the Cartesian Cogito, and the gay science to replace Cartesian science. Thanks for listening. Go team.